The goal of this town hall is to inform, encourage, and show how each of us can become better and more effective allies. In these challenging times, allyship is one act that does not require a grant, an IRB, or anyone's permission. We really think it's something that all of us can do right now. So with that, Calicia will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you. So our first speaker today needs no introduction to a lot of people. She's certainly an inspiration to me. And I just wanted to personally thank Dr. Carla Pugh for joining us last minute. So Dr. Pugh is a professor of surgery at Stanford University, and she's also the director of the Technology-Enabled Clinical Improvement Center. Dr. Pugh holds 3 patents on the use of sensor and data acquisition technology to minimize and characterize hands-on clinical skills. And her research has resulted in her being awarded the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers from President Barack Obama. She's the president-elect of the Society of Black Academic Surgery, and we're so pleased to have her here today. Carla, please welcome.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for joining us. And thank you, Calicia, Dr. Clark, and Dr. Chu for putting the effort in and continuing this series and this conversation. It's extremely important, and we are, and I say we, on behalf of African American surgeons as well as AASTownHall, are more than humbled, really, to have partners in this conversation. It's a lot, and we are all in a state of multiple emotions: excitement, pain, and it really helps to have friends when you're going through this process that was unexpected and also happening, you know, during a pandemic, which our whole world order is now changed. I then want to start by, you know, saying on our current president of AASTownHall, Dr. Andrea Hayes Jordan, is obviously really, really remiss that she couldn't be here. You know, we all are very excited to have her as our president. She is an amazing person, for those of you who haven't had a chance to meet her, and it's just very exciting to be able to work with her, but she sends her regards. I wanted to start off, just a little bit about AASTownHall, which, as you see, was started in 1989 when I was a medical student, and I've been a part of AASTownHall, you know, for over 25 years. And the main focus and mission for AASTownHall was mentoring and sponsoring. And so we are now looking at our organization and thinking the main thing with respect to advocacy on behalf of medical students, residents, fellows, faculty. What is the main goal for AASTownHall? And the first thing that comes to mind is really to partner with you all. We are all learning at the same time. And we need the partnerships, the allyship. And so this is really perfect, coming together and having this type of conversation. I have to say, the conversations that we have had as an organization are far and deep, if you will. There have been some things that we have been working on for 10 years specifically, and it's increased in terms of how do we address, as a small surgical society, the emails, the requests for assistance on the part of African American residents, Latino, a wide variety of residents send emails to us regularly. So there has been a lot of work for a long history in terms of partnering with program directors around the country, partnering with other faculty, partnering with residents, fellows. And we have continuously figured how to do this ourselves. To have an open framework to partner with others really, really facilitates it. It's the same as having a family member there when you have a complex patient, so that you have an ally in the partnership of the care. For us, these things, it can be overwhelming and extremely complex for individual faculty to try and look into things that are happening, and many of the things quite daunting and gut-wrenching to hear some of the stories of things we see. So I think just in terms of the three major points that I wanted to make is that people feel isolated. From an allyship perspective, there's a great fear of making a mistake. And we have to be patient but persistent and come together, just as we're doing here. So with respect to being isolated, many of the persons who come to us at AASTBAS are fearful of speaking up. They want us to know, they want us to help, but they're afraid for us to call and speak to anyone at their institution. Huge problem, because their fear is then retaliation or further isolation or being marked. So how do you really work on a problem when the person who comes to you has fear for their career? And so that's what has added to the complexity. And literally we then look amongst ourselves, is anyone at that institution? Does anyone know someone at the institution? And so we've gone through this systematic process of trying to figure out how to support the persons that call. But there is a big fear. I think what we've learned in this process is, because of that fear and the lack of reporting, many institutions are led to believe that they don't have a problem. And so I think with respect to the isolation, which is the on the part of the person who is receiving unwarranted behavior, it would be extremely, helpful for them to have a chair, a program director, or anyone to be purposeful in helping and looking to see if there are issues, and also providing some level of protection. We don't know how to do that. There's no training for that. And so that is one of our goals within AASTBAS, is to partner with the chairs and the program directors. And we are fast developing strategies and outlines in terms of how to gain the trust of the resident fellow or faculty persons in your institution. If you have someone who is of color in your institution, it is highly likely that they have experienced some level of microaggression or macroaggression or overt racism, 100%. And so it takes the leaders in the institution to speak up, to be upstanders, and to pound the pavement to find out what's happening and be supportive. Make phone calls. It actually would be easier for us at AASTBAS if you all called us than us having to see who knows who and make phone calls and try not to say names and try to figure out what's the lay of the land. We've been tiptoeing for a long time. And so to have folks actually call us and say, can we partner with you? We would welcome that with open arms. With respect to fear of making a mistake, mistakes are required. We are in uncharted territory. And so the simple statement that I have regarding that is that it is better for you to make a mistake trying to help us, trying to help the situation, than to not do anything at all. It is better for you to make a mistake trying to help than to not do anything at all. I know just from speaking to my colleagues, it's a petrifying fear, because we all want to feel good about ourselves. Nobody wants to be called a racist. Oh my goodness, like who wants to be called that? That's name calling. that I think is a horrible term, to be honest. I mean, I think that it sets us up for failure. But given the language that we have, we live in it, we adjust it, and I mean, we're surgeons, we can figure this out, right? We address fear, we address, difficulties on a daily basis. This one's personal, we like to feel good about ourselves, but talking to your colleagues, making phone calls, I mean, the bond of us as surgeons, there's a cohort there that stands at a very high level. I think right now we are all dying to figure out what is the end game. Please make phone calls, make mistakes, be vulnerable. Everyone has to be vulnerable in order for us to get to the other side. It's not going to happen without it. I think the same others people say that they don't have credibility to speak to the issue. Well, what is the issue? The issue is humanity. The issue is not allowing a group of people to be dehumanized. So if you are human, you can speak to the issue. Ask questions. Think about it in your, as you go about your daily life. What would it be like if someone said to you, or someone, said something to you that made it very clear that they felt you did not belong? Do you work here? Oh, where are you from? Like those kind of things. I also flip on the other side of that. I mean, I make mistakes too. I don't know what it's like to be Hispanic. I don't know what it's like to be Asian. I make mistakes all the time. So mistakes are required, but we are strong enough to address the mistakes. We're leaders. You can't let your leaders fail. Pull someone to the side if you hear something, if you think you said something, you feel bad about it, go and talk to somebody. I mean, I think that we just have to really, really partner with each other to be able to get to the conversation that needs to happen. Again, my real sort of heartache right now is for the trainees and the fellows, because I cannot imagine being at this point in your career where you're supposed to be taking in all of this knowledge and the time and effort spent to becoming an excellent surgeon. And now the whole world has changed, even with COVID, this is a lot all at once. And so I think that it's really imperative for every department, every program director to do something extra to show some support, get some answers, and it doesn't only have to happen in the medical school. That's the last thing that, to say, or within a department of surgery, there are other folks in the medical school, there are other folks in the sociology department, the business school. They do a lot more training in terms of professionalism, communication. They do a lot more of that very purposefully than we do. And so there's time to reach out and find some partners so that we can be strategic in addressing these issues. Thank you for allowing me to be here and to share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pugh. I just want to encourage our participants, please send us any questions that you may have through the Q&A function. Dr. Pugh, how meaningful is it to now have data to sort of support some of the missions that you and SBS have been really carrying out for over 30 years? I think, seeing the data from the second trial as it relates to training mistreatment and harassment across race, gender, and sexual or gender minorities was very eye-opening for me. How does that help your cause, and how does that help shape the activities that you guys hope to put forward?
Well, I think it goes back to one of the first things that I said. People, it actually is the backstory to the realization that residents, fellows, and faculty won't speak up. I mean, there's things that I won't say to my colleagues because I don't want them to feel, feel like I'm complaining or, and then to further isolate, like, okay, I'll, tiptoe around her because she's sensitive. So I think to have a venue where you can respond anonymously, that that is one way of getting to truth. And I think that the data speaks for itself. And I think that many institutions are finding out things that they never knew before about, their institution. They thought that they didn't have a problem. They thought everyone gets along. And now that there's not only data from, those surveys, other people locally are doing their own surveys, different institutions and medical schools, and people are shocked. And that's a good thing. So first thing in terms of being able to take care of a problem is recognizing that it's there. And I think that there will be less institutions that can stand bold and believe that they don't have a problem now that there's data, now that there's a conversation happening in ways for people to speak up without the fear of retaliation. The isolation still persists.
So one of the questions that we just got from the live feed, Dr. Pugh, do you have a way that someone might make a repair when they are told that something they said was harmful to a colleague?
We just had a session, we had a speaker here at Stanford from the business school, what to do, how to receive feedback, how to receive negative feedback for yourself. And when I listened to the lecture, I had lots of, expectations in terms of we're going to learn this specific surgical thing. And it's not surgical, it's traditional leadership skills. We have to really do some self-reflection and address the personal judge that we have of ourselves. It's not about you. It's not, you want to protect your being as that you're a good person. And so when someone gives you negative feedback, you take it personal, and then it prevents you from being able to look at it objectively and say, why did I think that way? How could I have actually said that? What training do I need? And be confident that you can do the training or learn and move on. And you will, it's the same thing that you learn a new operation. We have some fears there, but then once you see it and you do it, you get your colleagues, it's the same framework. So I sat there sort of a little lackluster, and I'm like, wow, that's the exact same thing we already do when we want to learn something new. And so just put a framework together. You have your moment, you're going to have your reaction like, wow, I can't believe I did that. Wow. But realize that anytime anyone says something to you about something you did, that's feedback to you as a leader. And you then can make a decision whether you're going to act on it or not. That does not mean that you are stained forever, but I think that's what people fear. And that's why it just gets blown up to this really big thing that, I don't want anybody to tell me I'm a racist, so I'm not going to have any conversations. And now I'm just, there's certain people I'm just not going to speak to. Like that's just not going to be a successful approach. And so we have to come into this knowing that we're not perfect, but we are extremely capable of learning and doing the right thing if we put our minds to it. And again, we're surgeons. I really stand by that. We learn so many difficult things. We can do this.
Perfect.
Great. Kalisha, we'll take the next question.
So one of the other questions was, can anonymous reporting systems also weaponize microaggressions? And, I'll make a brief comment on this. I do think it can, but I think it's also necessary. And one of the things that I'll say is I remember hearing a colleague say in response to the second trial data, this younger generation are just so sensitive and they're they just take things personally. And so I think in that way you can definitely weaponize, but I think that the data is really necessary to normalize the fact that these things happen. Dr. Pugh, any thoughts on that?
I'll be scientific with it. I mean, so the fact that it's even called a microaggression in the first place is our setup for failure, right? There's racism, we're all racist, and then there's microaggressions. What we learned about microaggressions in terms of the data is that 70% of them are unintended. Mm-hmm. So if it's unintended, then how can it be a real aggression if you just take that mindset, okay, you experience this microaggression, which is real, then you go through the motions, you ask, can you repeat yourself? I'm not sure I understood. Explain, you know, find what fits you in terms of your personality. But I think that if we weaponize the whole thing, then everyone's going to retreat to their corner. It's a setup for failure. And so, I mean, again, if 70% of it's unintended or unknowing, then that means you can be a partner with that person potentially to help them or find a way to give them some feedback.
Thank you, Dr. Pugh. So in interest of time, we're going to move on to our next speaker. We have some other questions that we'll try to address through our other talks here. So our next speaker, we'd like to introduce Dr. Minerva Romero Arenas. Dr. Romero Arenas is a co-founder of the Latino Surgical Society. The Latino Surgical Society, which started in 2017, is the youngest society here today, but one that is rapidly growing and very necessary. So thank you, Dr. Romero Arenas, for joining us today. And we'll turn this over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here on behalf of the other co-founders and our members. We're really happy to have a seat at the table. If you want to go ahead and pull up some slides for me. And today I was asked to address the topic of what are the needs in diversity, equity, and inclusion work in surgery. So I'll try to address that through a few different aspects today. Do you want me to share my screen?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay. So I want to start by just framing why do we care about diversity, equity, inclusion work in surgery. The slide that I have up really shows you the number of physicians based on self-reported race and ethnicity data. And in the outside aspect of the pie graph, you'll see numbers that show you the representation of the US population. And as you can see, there are several groups, namely the African American and the Hispanic Latino groups that are significantly underrepresented relative to the representation in the US population. Now, I could give you a whole talk just on what this means in terms of the impact for patients, for our communities, and more importantly, probably in terms of what we're discussing today, our peers and ourselves. But I want to just reframe that because I think this is an aspect that we sort of hear this term thrown around, URM, URIM, and this is really what we're discussing. There have been a lot of variety of disparities tied to this specific issue, and so this is why we're talking about this today. So I want to frame this in the sense that we have the ability to really mold where our field goes. And I thought this, this image of sort of the pottery making kind of helps frame the fact that we have it in our hands to really mold where we move from here. And it's a long overdue process that I think we have a great opportunity to have an impact, and rather than have other people make those changes for us, we can really shape it to what we need that to be at the local level and at the national level. So some key steps that I think are essential to diversify surgery really start at the top. And so it's become very evident that the leadership is essential. You know, truly the lack of diversity at the leadership level means that there's not only a need to diversify leadership, but it really puts the onus on our current leadership to really embrace this work and to really sort of take a very active role in diversifying the field. Another key step is acknowledging structural racism, and that's something that we've certainly seen in the past few months. As Dr. Clark mentioned, in light of many of the recent events centered around police brutality on our African American community, these statements that acknowledge the impact on our community and on our peers are really significant. And so that's a huge aspect of moving forward. We also need to adopt strategic initiatives to really impact change, and we need to integrate DEI efforts at all levels. So I'll move on and talk about the ways in which we want to engage leadership. I think it's essential that our leadership puts an emphasis on DEI efforts. And what that means is not only to support your faculty and your residents who are doing this work, but to actually be engaged in it. We know a lot about ways in which we can support, sponsor, and the fact that we need those types of initiatives in terms of mentoring and sponsorship. And so this really needs to be embraced by the leadership. One aspect that we have often addressed is the minority tax and how faculty, residents, and medical students who come from underrepresented backgrounds in medicine are often doing work outside of their day-to-day efforts to actually improve and increase pipeline development, and doing a lot of mentoring and doing additional work that we sort of term the minority tax. And I think it's really important that we start to move away from considering this as part of the job or maybe an unwritten responsibility, but to really acknowledge it and value these efforts, which really are going to help push the needle in a positive direction. Just like we think about structural plans to develop our departments, I think leadership can take on DEI as part of the departmental goals and incorporate all of these aspects into the different goals that you set every year. And that's one way that you can also maintain engaged in this, and to really champion institutional support. And those are areas in which our leaders can really be effective at change. Certainly not the only areas, but this would be sort of a start of readily identifiable areas where our leaders can be involved. In terms of acknowledging the structural racism, we think we need to recognize the impact that it has on our patients and their outcomes. We need to recognize the impact on our faculty and on our learners at all levels. We just saw the trauma that the recent events had on everyone in the community and across the world. And to some degree, it was sort of expected for everyone to just move on, business as usual. And I think, all of the different movements that we've seen to acknowledge the impact that these events have had have been very meaningful to all of us who have been impacted by this. In addition to just acknowledging the impact, though, it's important to provide education programs. And this can include education on basically racism and bias. I like that Dr. Pugh already addressed the issue of not simply labeling it as a microaggression, but to really just acknowledge that it can be a very blatant display of bigotry, and it's important to provide education to everyone on that, to acknowledge that its history in medicine, and to really reframe the discussion towards social determinants of health. So in terms of developing strategic initiatives, medical schools can engage in reviewing the educational curriculum. This can include eliminating race as a biological determinant, but rather acknowledging that it's a societal construct and how this has impacted health. To acknowledge the impact of social determinants of health, and as we discussed, review the data and review the outcomes of our patients based on the SDH. We can also look to modify our educational tools, whether that's your didactic materials, textbooks, and evaluate whether these are truly inclusive of our US population. And really engage people at all levels to really develop innovative solutions that can help lead to improved patient outcomes and other aspects of DEI. Now, in terms of looking at how do we integrate these efforts at all levels, it's time to review our medical schools admissions process. Holistic review of applicants has been ongoing for quite a while, but now we need to look at what's happening to those students who are now in our training programs. How are we structuring our residency interview selection processes and retention of residents? We had some very troubling data published a couple of years ago that essentially identified being a woman, being Hispanic or Latino as two of the top factors in attrition from surgical residency. And that attrition was impacted not just at the early junior years, which is when most residents drop out of training, but for Hispanic and Latino residents, it was actually attrition through the chief year. And so we really need to reevaluate what are the programs in place to really retain our residents. We also want to look at faculty recruitment, faculty retention, and promotion. And this goes back to integrating the leadership and engaging in the mentoring and the sponsorship that can really help people flourish. There's also going to be a need for a leadership pipeline, as we've addressed. Once we go climbing up that academic ladder, there's a significant disparity in representation in leadership levels. And so this is another area where we can really integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to develop and continue that pipeline. And again, don't leave it all up to us. We have to really eliminate the minority tax, and we have to acknowledge that this is an issue that should really be important to everyone. As we've seen from the integration of women into the workforce, a lot of initiatives and policies that change, for example, to make the working environment better for women actually turn out to be better initiatives that actually impacted all employees positively. And so it's really important that we start to take this work on as something that is relevant to everyone. So with that in mind, I am going to leave you with a couple of action items that you can do today. The Latino Medical Student Association is building a residency hub. So if you scan that QR code into your browser, you can register your program and showcase how your program wants to recruit diverse residents. The Student National Medical Association is also hosting a virtual residency fair in September, and you can email conferences@snma.org to really become involved in that, and again, try to build and recruit a more diverse program. This residency fair is going to be open to multiple organizations, including SNMA and LMSA. And I want to make a plug for our AWS DEI Award, which is just inaugurated this year. Our deadline is coming up actually at the end of the week. We actually extended it to this Friday, the 28th. But this is another opportunity for residents, fellows, and students to engage with our organizations and to engage with leadership at all levels. So I want to thank you again on behalf of myself and all of the co-founders of the Latino Surgical Society. We're very happy to be here and to meet a need that really was long overdue amongst surgeons And I want to just encourage you, let's move forward together and keep in mind that, you know, we want to come up with a great product and it's in our hands at this time.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Romero Arenas, for your talk here. You know, you've talked a lot about leadership, and certainly it's important and critical to allyship. Here's a question from the audience. So in terms of the leadership, how do you address racism at the highest level of leadership at your institution? Where do you go from there?
This is a really difficult question, and I think Dr. Pugh alluded earlier to having essentially a safe space. We all know that it's a very difficult issue to address, and it's not necessarily something that people want to bring up. We hate bringing out the woman card, the race card, the this card. You know, I walk around with a deck of cards in my pocket, in my purse. So it's really important to create a safe space, identify people who are designated. You know, we have ombudspersons at all institutions, and really sort of create a safe space and make that very publicly available information to people at your work. How can the leadership change? You know, it really is putting a lot of onus, as I mentioned earlier, to engage the leadership. And I think the education piece is also really essential, because unless we see it and unless we are aware, we're evidence-based folks, right? We're driven by data. And so all of those educational programs really help to dispel some of the myths around the fact that people think diversity, equity, and inclusion is sometimes a code word for I'm lowering the bar. And that is not true at all. You need to really start thinking about the fact that we bring things to the table as well. We bring skills, we bring life experience, and we bring a whole another set of qualities that really will help enrich the work environment.
So one of the questions that we've gotten a lot has talked about how we eliminate minority tax or create initiatives without overextending our minority colleagues. So any comments about that?
Would anybody like to do this talk for me? No, I think it's been really inspiring to see how much support has come out, how much change we've seen just in the past few months. I remember, studying for my written boards in 2016 and just being overwhelmed by the string and rash of police brutality that we were seeing at that time. And really, it just wasn't the same response. We didn't have that outpouring of support and of acknowledgement that has followed this, more recent. It's unfortunate that it's ongoing. So how do we eliminate the minority tax? We're going to have a series of these talks where we're engaging everyone and encouraging people, but you can start by educating yourself. The SNMA has put out a reading list if people like to read books on anti-racism. You can read and educate yourself on allyship. And you can really start by just listening and acknowledging your colleagues' experiences without putting that burden of prove to me that this exists, but rather I just want to learn from you. And I think reframing the conversation can have a tremendous impact.
I'd also like to add to that I think a lot of minorities, and especially underrepresented in medicine minorities, are actually interested in doing this DEI work, and they're doing it. But they're not doing it at high levels, and they're not necessarily getting exposure in ways that build CVs. And I think one of the things that's happened in response to everything that's happening societally is everyone wants to do something. And I would ask that if you're going to do something and you're going to involve your colleagues, involve them in a high level way. I can't tell you how many recent grants I've reviewed where, you know, all of the PIs are white, male, female, and they're specifically looking at URM student or trainee development. And not a single person of color is included on these grants, whether they're NIH funded or institutionally funded. But we know that on the back end, the plan is to get them to be mentors. And the mentors are doing the work. And they're not getting the credit, they're not getting the recognition, and they're not getting the CV builders. There was a recent publication in a very high level journal, actually, that looked at racial inequities in academia. And the first and final authors were white, and all the middle authors were people of color. You know, these are ways that you can make sure that you're not overtaxing people of color. You know, get them involved, but also get them involved in meaningful ways. Many of them are doing the work and may not have the access to resources that you might have to make this a formal grant funding proposal or to get a publication in New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA. And so I think that there are definitely ways to get people involved without basically sort of overtaxing them and helping to build and shape careers as we go. All right, so I think in the interest of time, we're going to move on to our next speaker. So it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Stein. Dr. Sharon Stein is a colorectal surgeon and associate professor of surgery at Case Western Reserve University. She's also the director of University Hospital Surgical Outcome Center. And she is currently the president of the Association of Women Surgeons, and she's going to talk with us a little bit today as well. Dr. Stein, we're very excited to have you.
Well, thanks for having me. I feel very humbled to be part of this panel. Just listening to everybody, it's really awesome to be having these conversations. I mean, also when Dr. Clark and Dr. Chu asked me to talk today, I asked them if I could talk kind of about my personal experience. And I think it's a little bit different talk than the ones that Dr. Pugh and Dr. Romero Arenas just gave. Because I'm going to talk about how to become an effective ally as a person, not necessarily as a society. I think that there's certainly room for that, and I think Dr. Wang is going to talk a little bit about that as well. But that's kind of where this talk is going to be. Let's see if I can make that move. So the first disclosure, or only disclosure I want to give you, is that I'm trying. This is a process to me. This is not something that you end up and you feel like you're ever done with this work. I think at the point when you're done with this work, it's because you're no longer looking deep enough to figure out what's going on. I think this will be a process that I'll be continuing to try to do better at for my entire life. And so I don't know that I'm an effective ally. This is something I'm working on actively, and hopefully I'll just give you some pointers on what I've done, and hopefully that will be helpful to you. I really like this graphic. This talks about equality and becoming an ally for LGBT community. But I really like the depth of this spectrum here, that you start off as someone who's just kind of willing to listen, and then you end up as someone who's really willing to go to bat to change things in society. And I think depending on where you are in a specific day and where you are in your learning and how you're feeling, you probably waver throughout this spectrum, where sometimes you're really starting to get it and sometimes you really feel like, gosh, I'm doing a good job, I'm moving forward. The other thing I think this calls to mind, although we're concentrating on racism today, is that we're never going to stop needing to be inclusive of people and to be an ally for people who are underrepresented or in some way are different. And I think that this really, I just wanted to mention that because I think it's an important point that, you know, hopefully someday we won't have to talk about racism, but I'm sure there'll be something else as humans that we need to talk about. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. First thing you need to do as an ally is to really look in the mirror. And Dr. Pugh spoke about this, and I really think it's important to kind of stop and take a look at yourself. And it's really hard. It's hard because we all got brought up and we heard our own stories and our own traditions being brought up that our version of the world was correct. And the reality of the situation is that our version of the world is one version of the world. And if we want to see something through other people's eyes, we have to be open enough to see that we're not seeing it to begin with, to recognize that there are areas that we need to learn and we need to grow. So I kind of bound being an effective ally into 3 sections. One is to understand the history of the people or peoples that you're trying to be an ally for. 2 is to recognize what the present looks like for that ally. And 3 is to work toward a better future. Oops. Sorry, my computer is not there. All right, so as as Minerva said, there are multiple ways that you can start to educate yourself to quote unquote do the work. I think this is a really, really important step. I think it's important that those of us who want to be allies actually go out and do the things we need to do to educate ourselves. What's really interesting, on June 21st, a number of the both fiction books and nonfiction books on the New York Times bestseller list were things about racism and anti-racism. There are a zillion different lists. You can look on any different publication you want, and there are lists that are available to start doing the work. But I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the ones that I felt to be most helpful, and maybe you'll find them to be the same. One is the podcast of 1619. This was done by New York Times, and it's really interesting for understanding history. Again, it speaks to the fact that the version of history that maybe I learned in elementary school and high school, and I was a history major in college, isn't the same history that everybody else has. It's not, I didn't get the whole story. And understanding some of the places where my story didn't fill all the gaps in is really important. It's important because it allows us to see things, to find out about things, to find out about the fact that for many Black people, touching their hair is disrespectful. And it comes back to the fact that when Black people were slaves in this country, that was one of the things that owners did to check on them, to see if they were adequate. And so those type of things, which may in some ways, well, gosh, you never knew about that. But that's the kind of thing that you need to learn. You need to learn about the history so that you can be better informed and make different decisions about what you say, how you talk about it, what you do. This is about recognizing the present. And I really like this series by Emmanuel Acho. He's a former NFL player. I'm a sports fan myself, so maybe I relate to him well. But he has these conversations that he calls uncomfortable conversations with a Black man. And when we're talking about minority tax, when we're talking about asking people who are of color to explain everything to me that I don't know, I need to find a different way to find some of those things out. And these conversations, they're available on YouTube. He actually just did a series with Oprah Winfrey that's available on Apple TV. And they're about, depending on which one they are, maybe 10 minutes long. But you can learn about some of the things. And he sits down to you as a friend would and answers questions from people or has discussions with people or just talks to you about the things that are uncomfortable to say. And it's really important during this process, when you're looking in the mirror, when you're learning about the history, that there are going to be some uncomfortable conversations you need to have with yourself and with others. And this is a way to kind of start those conversations. In addition, I think it's really important that we look at some of the things that are happening in our community, the surgical community. And I'm a Twitter person. I'm sure that there's an equivalent on Instagram, Black in the Ivory hashtag, or Facebook. But this for me was really informative. It was really informative because it showed me what my friends, what my colleagues are going through right now. That the types of, whether you call them microaggressions, macroaggressions, or just inequities that people suffer on a daily basis is really striking. And I think if you read through some of this hashtag, if you read through some of the stories, if you amplify some of the things that people are saying, we'll be better at helping our colleagues. I'll be better at figuring out that, just as Dr. Pugh said, that there are other people who are still going through this or still experiencing this, and you can be aware that this is happening in your own institution. And for me, without having to ask everybody at my institution what's going on, this was a way for me to kind of get maybe a little bit of a clue of what I wasn't seeing. How do you work for a better future? Well, one of the ways that one of the people that I've really liked is that Verna Myers. She has a wonderful TED Talk that talks about walking boldly towards diversity, which is just wonderful. And she also has a book about moving diversity forward. And as a surgeon, I will say that doing something is so important to me that is probably the hardest part. To some extent, I can sit down and I can read, I can watch a podcast, I can listen to something on, Apple TV, but I want to feel like I'm doing something. We're all doers. We need to figure that out. How do we do things? And there are some ways to do things from these types of books. But for me, I needed to kind of sit down and make lists and figure out what I could do. And these are small little things, but I started a racial diary. I started a diary that wrote down every time in the since the death of George Floyd and the riots, and the police brutality. I started to write down every time I heard something, I saw something that was striking to me that I hadn't noticed before. And I made a list. And at this point, in about 3 months, it's a list of about 75 different things that I have seen in that period of time. And on the other side, I started making a list of things I could do differently and things I do differently, whether that's the opportunity to sponsor a different medical student or resident to do something that I might not have thought of before, whether that's amplifying someone else's statement in an opportunity where there's someone who has already said something and maybe it was overlooked in the conversation, and then by giving them back the credit and amplifying, bringing that topic back up, I can do something different. Those types of things to me make a difference, because I can look at a list, and now I have a list of about 45, 50 things that I've done differently in the last few months. And when I look back at that and I look for myself and I think I'm doing this and each of you, the people here, are doing something similar, then I can think that maybe together we can make a change. And maybe even though we haven't made all the differences in the world, those small differences can make a big difference over time. The other thing that's really important to me is to understand that I'm going to be uncomfortable in this process. There are going to be times when I misspeak. I just did when I just talked about the riots. That was a misspoken word. But what's important is that I don't stop talking. That if I only stay in my comfort zone, and this Dr. Pugh said as well, that I'm never going to get better at what I'm trying to do. I'm never going to be different than I was before all of this happened, than I was 2 years ago. And if I really want to make a difference, if I really want to be an ally, I have to be willing to continue to speak to me to be a part of this conversation. I think it's a really important and meaningful conversation. And hopefully for some people who want to be an ally, my talk will have been helpful. So thanks. Oops, I'm done. Let's see that.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stein, for sharing your personal story, reflections, and actions. The AWS has always been at the forefront of many initiatives and really an example for all the societies in terms of what we can do to make a difference here. We have so many questions, but in the interest of time, we're gonna have to move on. We're gonna try to answer some of these questions through written responses. So our next speaker, we'd like to introduce Dr. Tracy Wang. Dr. Tracy Wang is the president
such as the central surgical and Western surgical, Southern surgical, and then we all belong to different specialty societies based on, our chosen subspecialty. And many of these societies were founded when our society was in a very different time. I think the AAS of some of the ones I mentioned was the most recent, and that was in 1966. And the common thread, I think, of all of these organizations is that they define us by what we chose to do professionally. So we are physicians, we are surgeons, We are endocrine surgeons, colorectal surgeons, surgical oncologists. We live in the Midwest, we live in the South, but very much by what we do as a profession. And it wasn't until 1981, I think it was, and I use this term identity very loosely because I couldn't think of a better word, but it wasn't until 1981 when the AWS was founded that there became surgical societies that defined us by who we are, right? By our gender, by our race or ethnicity, by our sexual orientation or gender identity. And now there are, as I've shown on the screen, these are just representative of a few, but there's AASTOWN, the Asian Academic Surgery, the Latino Surgical Society, and most recently AOSA, which is the Association of Out Surgeons and Allies. And again, I'm just naming a few. But that doesn't take away, and I think this has gotten to some of the questions we've had today about the role of the other organizations in allyship, so that we aren't burdening the non-majority with doing all of the work. So I wanted to walk through sort of the history of SAS as an example of how different institutions, societies, and organizations can become allies just by what they do. So in 2011, at the 6th Academic Surgical Congress, which as we know is a joint meeting of the AAS and SUS, then President Dai Chung, he was president of the SUS, invited Dr. Dan Nakayama to speak at this presidential section. He gave a talk called Unconscious Bias in Academic Surgery, which eventually led to this publication that I've shown in the Annals of Surgery. And it was a direct result of that address that our 9 founding members, shown here, met later that year at the American College of Surgeons and decided to form a new surgical society. And like Dr. Pugh touched on with SBAS, initially it was to provide a networking forum for Asian academic surgeons, but they quickly evolved because they realized that more was needed. And so we became a society that provided the opportunity for the professional development of its members. And so each of these founding members provided seed money for the creation of an award for the best research submitted to the Academic Surgical Congress by a SAS member, and for scholarships for both the residents and fellows and for junior faculty to attend the career development courses that are sponsored by the AAS and SUS. And so these have now evolved to this list of awards, travel grants, scholarships, and 6 visiting professorships that we have specifically for junior faculty each year. But it's through the generosity of our members, and it's through partnerships with other societies, not just the AAS and the SUS, but with the American Surgical and with leaders across different institutions that we've been able to accomplish this. And really importantly for us, in 2016, we evolved from dim sum lunches at the ACS meeting every year to having our first annual meeting. And so we were hosted very graciously by Mary Hahn at Stanford University, with George Yang and Cindy Kim hosting as well. And we focused on scientific presentations. We also focused a great deal on professional development and leadership skills through workshops, small working groups, partnerships with ASCEND, which is a Pan-Asian organization for business professionals. And we've had multiple panel sessions at each of our meetings devoted to addressing common issues in academic surgery, such as promoting diversity, pathways to leadership, and that type of thing. And in all of our meetings, we've been really intentional about inviting leaders within academic surgery. So beyond just this now 16 or 17 Asian chairs of surgery across the United States, we've also invited chairs of surgery from other institutions who are not Asian, leaders of other surgical societies, leaders of deans across institutions, and leaders of organizations like the AAMC. And so for those of you who may not be familiar, because you probably recognize most other people here, this is Atul Grover, who's previously Executive Vice President and now Executive Director of the AAMC Research and Action Institute. And this was, again, the goal was always to highlight the issues that we as Asian academic surgeons face, many of which are very similar to the other people who have spoken this evening, but also somewhat different. And so it was important to bring these to light. And one of the comments that one of our leaders heard from a few years ago from someone who attended was that they weren't even aware that this was a problem for Asian Americans. We've also developed relationships with different societies. So Susan Tsai is our SAS rep to the Association of Women Surgeons. Dan Chu is the SAS rep to the AAS. And we have ongoing discussions with the SUS, with SBAS, and all of these organizations about how we can collaborate to bring forward the issues that we are all facing. And, you know, we've reached out to non-Asian academic surgeons to join our membership, and it's through their allyship that we were able to receive, apply for and receive a seat on the board of governors. So Ken Murayama is now the SAS rep to the ACS, and that was about 9 years from the time that we were initially founded, which is really tremendous support from everybody that we've reached out to. And I use SAS as an example only because it's the organization that I am most familiar with, but it's very similar to the work that I think we've heard from the other societies, AWS, SBAS, Latino Surgical Society this evening, are doing with their membership and outreach. And what I wanted to emphasize that we would not exist, SAS would not exist if it were not for other societies like the AAS and the SUS, providing platforms and opportunities to grow, you know, meetings at the ACS where people could, you know, we could meet in person, meet and discuss these issues, and to have predecessors like the SBAS, which has really done a lot of the pioneering work for what we hope to do. And so when I think about the role of societies and organizations, I hope that this kind of gave a history of really how everybody can serve as allies and advocates. You know, we belong to different societies because of the role they play in our professional development. And I think it's equally important that we find value in membership in different ways. And so when I think about the question of the role of allyship, it's really, you know, these societies and organizations that we used to travel all over the, you know, country and world for up until about 6 months ago, they were venues for us to connect with each other. And so what can these societies and organizations do besides just being these venues? So I think it's really important that they show support. And we've touched on this a little bit already this evening. So this past spring, many societies voiced support for the anti-Asian racism that we saw associated with COVID-19 and for Black Lives Matter, as we continue to do tonight. And admittedly, we live in a really partisan country, but I think that the support shown by the societies and organizations was profoundly important at this time in our history. And it's something that should not be underestimated. Secondly, many societies now have task forces or committees on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And while these are really, really important, it's also important that they not just exist, but that they actually provide a platform and then importantly create opportunities. So these graphics represent some of the things that societies have done in collaboration with each other to develop the pipeline for leadership and create new pathways and to reach out to the underrepresented to have a voice in their different societies. And I think that's really important. And lastly, as we move towards, you know, the goal of greater diversity and inclusion, it's really critical to acknowledge who's at the table, because I think many societies are doing a really, really good job about it. But I think we have to sit and then ask ourselves who's not at the table, because we are not monolithic as women, as Blacks, as Latina, Hispanics, or as Asian Americans. And so, you know, if we're not thinking all the time about who's not at the table, we are going to exclude someone. And so I think I challenge everybody to just continue to ask that question of ourselves. And if there are people who are not included, invite them, because I'm sure they will say yes, and oftentimes they're just waiting for the opportunity to be asked. So, you know, I included this cartoon because, you know, groupthink, but, you know, they all look alike. So, and then I'm just going to invite you to our 5th annual meeting, which is in a month. It will be over Zoom and not in Hawaii, unfortunately, but hopefully you'll have an opportunity to join in. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak this evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wang. So we're going to move on to our final speaker for the evening, and then we're going to actually, I think, hopefully have a minute or two for questions. So I wanted to introduce Dr. Thomas Varghese. He is the Chief Value Officer and Interim Executive Medical Director at Huntsman Cancer Institute at the University of Utah. He also is a current chair of the JEDI Committee of the SUS, the Justice, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the SUS. And he's going to talk with us a little bit about specifically the SUS commitment to making meaningful change in academic surgery. So Tom, thank you.
Thanks so much, Alicia, and deeply appreciate the opportunity to share this work, as well as to all the amazing speakers and the attendees out there. It's an incredible group as well. In terms of disclosures, just because we did come up with a catchy name with the JEDI committee, we do have some images, but relax, there's no copyright infringement as well. I think that one of the things that we need to do is really acknowledge this was really the reflection of a vision initially from our past president, Dr. Greg Kennedy at UAB, as well as the ongoing support, enthusiastic support from our current president, Dr. Susan Wong, in terms of forming this committee and the development of the charter. And really the charter laid out two sets of objectives. The first was to make sure that we adopt inclusion, diversity, equity, and justice as core values of the SUS throughout every single activity, functioning, collaboration, and partnerships that the SUS engages in, and to make sure that we follow some guiding principles and enact some strategies as we do this important work. The guiding principles really are three. That is that we act now. We're not waiting. You know, we're not saying that, oh, it took 100 years to lead to the current situation, so we're going to wait 100 years for the solution. That doesn't make sense. We need to act now. We need to make sure that we're really appreciating everything that's going on. And the goal is obviously to change the culture, because by changing the culture, that's what leads to the sustainable solutions going forward. And of course, we embrace this concept of continuous improvement, that we are not static human beings. We can continuously learn from each other, from the world around us. And as mentioned before in the prior talks, that we're continuously seeking input as well. Sum all that up, this is what we do in every single thing that we do. We stand up for others, we speak, and we act. That's the key thing. If we're not sure, just do it. We're not sure how to get involved in something. Well, we reach out and try to learn. We're not sure about how best to implement something. That's fine. Let's just start doing something. The silence is what's led to the current situation, and we need to change that as well. In terms of partnerships, obviously it's represented by many of the people as well. This is kind of the initial steps that the SUS did. We are collaborating with all of these organizations. Would I love to see one day every single society and member of the House of Surgery represented on a slide? Absolutely. And so we're continuing to reach out, and we'd love to keep populating and make this a very colorful slide in the years ahead. But what do we do with those partnerships? And one of the things that we're building right now is an awareness campaign. This event tonight is an example of an awareness campaign event. So we can imagine webinars. We put a proposal in for a hot topic session at the upcoming annual Academic Surgical Congress meeting. Hopefully that'll be successful. There could be other campaign events locally at different institutions, at meetings, and we're hoping to continue that awareness campaign as well. But it really is about implementation efforts. And these implementation efforts, as mentioned in the chat by a couple of questions, as well as by many of the speakers, it really talks about education. I think that Dr. Stein mentioned that, we have to take the efforts to educate ourselves. We then, share that wisdom with others. But education is important. And of course, developing toolkits and kind of in what we affectionately call implementation bundles. Those bundles that we can use locally at our institutions, throughout the organizations, within our department, within our division, strategic partnerships. These are the keys that we do that. And so that's kind of the overview, or kind of the plan that we've developed. Obviously there'll be things that'll focus within the organization in the SUS, but a lot of this is we are stronger together and we rise together. And that's really the goal as we do this going forward. And I realize that we're already over the allotted time, but it just means that this is a great conversation to have. But I really do appreciate the opportunity to kind of share the vision that the SUS is embarking on in the time ahead.
Thanks so much, Tom. So Tracy, I'm going to pose this question to you. How can we make DEI efforts meaningful or scholarly activity in academic surgery? And more importantly, how do you get your departments to fund this? So I'm going to pick on you since you're at my institution.
Thanks. So I think making it a scholarly activity, I know that there are examples of the University of Michigan did the Michigan Promise, and I know they've written about their experiences. I think it's challenging because, you can't go back and look at a database, right, and churn through that. But I think that journals, are also welcoming of discussions about this. And I think having, we talk about societies and organizations, I think the editors of journals across surgery and academic medicine in general are really open to hearing perspectives. And I think that begins to have the introduction that this work is important, and it's important academic work. It's not just, something you do in your free time and spare time. The budget, how do we commit resources to it? I think, some of us, like myself, we have positions within our department that is supported by our departmental leaders to do this type of work. I saw one of the questions earlier, asking how do you make this important to your senior leadership if they don't see it as important. And it's really hard, and it takes a lot of difficult conversations. I think it's finding one or two allies that are in senior leaderships or who have the ability to speak to senior leadership really openly and honestly, just begin to introduce those concepts and have those discussions. And it may take more time in some institutions than in others, but I think the conversations need to start to be had. And I also think it's important, I know we're running close on time, but I think it's important for other leaders at other institutions, like other chairs of surgery, to leaders of SBAS, as Dr. Pugh was mentioning before, to reach out. I know we don't want to have the minority tax, but I think setting the example is really important, and people will start to realize how important it is.
One last question. Thanks, Tracy. One last question for Dr. Stein and for Dr. Varghese. What can we do from a resident's perspective, or even as an institute, to help teach how to respond to microaggressions, macroaggressions? Are there training platforms out there on how to respond, how to recognize them?
I think there are a lot of different ways to do it. I think Dr. Pugh spoke to the fact that you needed to have something that feels kind of authentic to you, because I think it's really hard, because there's usually some sort of power dynamic in the middle of that as well. And I know I can remember times where I didn't feel like I had the power to be able to say something back. I think even just calling attention to it, saying, I'm sorry, I think I misunderstood you. What did you just say? Make somebody stop and think about what they just said. And some people will go ahead and just say the same thing that was inappropriate again. But I think for someone who is thoughtful, hopefully it was a misstep and they can be like, oh, I guess that didn't come out the way I wanted to. And it gave that person a way to gracefully realize that they didn't do it. I think the question is, kind of what happens and what do you do, and whether or not you have that kind of dynamic where you can say something. And yes, there are courses and there are books written about how to respond to something, but I think you have to find something that kind of sounds and feels really authentic to you to be able to say something.
I agree. I mean, I think that there's the personal learning opportunities, and then there's a power of working together. Trainees are very powerful when they're working together. And I think that it's one of the things that you should never try. I mean, you could try to do it in isolation. It's just not going to be as effective as if you do it in partnership with other people. So you can imagine, so one example comes to mind is what the University of Michigan and the University of Maryland put together called the Cultural Complications Curriculum. That concept was brought forth by Dr. Chelsea Harris, who's a general surgery resident. That was her idea, and then she reached out to Dr. Leslie Dossett at the University of Michigan. They got the support from Dr. Justin Dimmick. They did it, rolled it out underneath the Association of Women Surgeons, He for She Task Force. Next thing you know, that's a publication in the Annals of Surgery. So I just gave you an example of something that was a very powerful initiative, which I think that Dr. Wong has piloted already at the Medical College of Wisconsin. I personally think that's an example of, along with M&M, you talk about different aspects of cultural issues. That's going to be very powerful in the years ahead. And that all came from a general surgery resident. And so those are the examples I think that we need to do better. I also think that it's a difficult time because this is going to be messy. We are going to make mistakes. But one of the things that I remember many of my mentors telling me is that ability to give grace to others, give others the benefit of the doubt. And I think that if we come at it with that way and say that, hey, they may have genuinely made a mistake. Is it a result of their upbringing, their experiences, their ignorance, whatever it is, and allow them an opportunity to course correct would be a great thing, rather than assuming that they did it with the worst intentions. Does that mean that there are evil people out there? Of course there are, but I think that I'm hoping the vast majority in the House of Surgery are good people who truly came to this field because they wanted to help others.
Well, thank you so much, Tom and Sharon, for those comments. I'm going to turn over to Eugene, who is going to sort of send us off tonight. Dr. Kim, of course, is the current president of the AAS. Dr. Kim, a few last words.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank Callie and Dan for just the amazing work with this. I continue to learn. I think as the topic that came up many times from all of you is education and self-education and seeking out those resources. And Sharon, you shared some wonderful things. Some of them I have read and some I look forward to reading. And it starts with education of our staff. And then eventually, as Minerva had stated, we may have to look at how we even admit our medical students and our residents one day. Tracy taught us about how important it is, like this, to collaborate with other societies where great ideas can be shared with all the people who've attended today. And I think all of us will take something back and help become better allies for everyone. And in turn, we'll all be better. I look forward to further collaborations, including at the Academic Surgical Congress. And I want to thank everybody for coming.
All right, thanks everyone, and thanks to our participants today. These questions were fantastic. We could have continued for quite some time. We appreciate you all, and we look forward to circling back around to some of these topics again in the next few months. Take care.